let's take you now live to the UN. President John Dramani Mahama is addressing the UN General Assembly, and he's expected to touch on key global issues. Let's cross over live to the Assembly.
His Excellency, and invite him to address the Assembly.
Thank you, Madam President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. At this 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly, I'd like to speak about Africa's role in the future of this organization. However, it's impossible to do that without first considering the collective role that Africa played in its founding, which was small and relatively insignificant. Of the 51 member states involved in the founding of the United Nations in 1945, only 4 were African: Egypt, Ethiopia, Liberia, and South Africa. It is important to point out that the United Nations came into being in the aftermath of World War II because of the inability of its predecessor, the League of Nations, to avert a large-scale global conflict, which had been its guiding purpose when it was founded in 1920 at the end of the First World War. Out of the 42 founding member states of the League of Nations, only 3 were African: Liberia, the Union of South Africa, and Ethiopia. Egypt was to join later in 1937. Africa's overall participation in the organization's founding was minimal and relatively unimportant. That's because before all the other talks and meetings, representatives from a group of 14 nations gathered in Berlin for a series of discussions that began in 1884 and which led to the partitioning and formal colonization of the African continent, which is also called the Scramble for Africa. It has famously been written that past is prologue. Well, in the past, the majority of the 54 nations that now comprise Africa were never offered a seat at the table where plans for a new world order were being drawn. But, Madam President, as fate would have it, the tables are turning, and Africa's role in the authorship of whatever is yet to come for this world is going to be huge, and it will be consequential. According to this organization's own projections, by the year 2050, more than 25% of the world's population is expected to come from the African continent. Additionally, by 2050, 1/3 of all young people aged between 15 to 24 will be residing on the African continent. So you see, the future of this world is African. Allow me to say this once again a little louder for those of you in the back. The future is African. Already today, Africa is a catalyst for human potential and development, as well as for economic reform and ecological stability. Africa is a catalyst for systemic change. If this reality, which is fact-based and straightforward, seems provocative or unsettling, perhaps it's because you are viewing it through the lens of centuries of filters, colonialism and imperialism, and the resulting implicit bias. Maybe you are unaware of the resilience of African nations or their remarkable ability to make a strong comeback just when you think it's safe to count them out. That is what is happening right now in my own country, Ghana. Our constitution limits leaders to 2 4-year terms. In January, I was sworn in for a second term, which, let me point out, was non-consecutive with my first term. Our currency, the Ghana cedi, was rapidly depreciating. Faced with rising inflation, a huge debt burden, and low morale amongst our citizens, my new administration settled down quickly and embarked on an ambitious program of comprehensive transformation designed to restructure Ghana's economic foundation and enhance our competitive standing globally. We refer to this process of recalibration as our reset agenda. In just 8 months, we have achieved significant reduction in inflation from 23.8% in December 2024 to 11.5% in August 2025, restoring price stability for our citizens. Additionally, our currency, the Ghana cedi, has appreciated considerably against other currencies, with Bloomberg reporting it as the best performing currency in the world at one point. Our improved sovereign credit rating reflects increasing investor confidence in our economy. And our 24-hour economy initiative promises to transform our economy. And there's a renewed willingness amongst our people to trust that their elected officials have Ghana's interests at heart and that we're progressing together. Madam President, I believe that in honor of this milestone celebration, the United Nations should also embark on a process of serious recalibration and establish its own reset agenda. Since the organization's founding, the number of UN member nations has nearly quadrupled. And quite frankly, it is not the same world that it was back then when the UN was formed. I mentioned earlier that I began my second non-consecutive term as president this past January. My first term ended in January 2017. In that span of time, 8 years, the world has changed with such ferocity. My first days in office after my return felt as though I had just awakened from a Rip Van Winkle-style sleep. Now, no, that was only after 8 years. Imagine then what it will be like after 80 years since the founding of the United Nations. In 1945, the sun had not yet set on the largest empire in history. The most common mode of international travel was by sea. The personal computer had not been invented, let alone made portable. And television, a new convenience, was still in its infancy, albeit in black and white color. Relations between the US and the Soviet Union were turning frosty, with Winston Churchill declaring that an iron curtain has descended across the European continent. Fast track 80 years on. In today's world, hundreds of thousands of commercial flights take off and land every day. Libraries have been digitized so that volumes of literature can exist on a small device, small enough to fit inside your pocket. We live in a world of cryptocurrency, artificial intelligence, social media, the internet and its dark hidden dungeon of the dark web, all of which carry a potential threat to global peace and security. Climate change is real, and we're fighting a losing battle against the loss of Maldives and other island nations to the rising sea level, against the loss of Timbuktu to desertification and the Amazon forest to global warming and deforestation. Madam President, the UN Founding Charter is outdated when it comes to representation in this August Assembly. The most powerful post-World War II nations are still being rewarded with an almost totalitarian guardianship over the rest of the world. And yet, the first sentence in Chapter 2, Article 1 of the UN Charter declares that the organization is based on the principle of sovereign equality of all its members. If this were true, and was the case, a continent as large as Africa, with its numerous UN member states, would have at least one permanent seat on the Security Council. Furthermore, we believe that veto power should not be restricted to only 5 nations, nor should it be absolute. There must be a mechanism in this House for the General Assembly to challenge a veto. No single nation should be able to exercise an absolute veto to serve its own interests in a dispute. In 1995, during the 50th anniversary of the United Nations, Nelson Mandela stood in this very spot, and he said, "The United Nations has to reassess its role, redefine its profile, and reshape its structures. It should truly reflect the diversity of our universe and ensure equity among the nations in the exercise of power within the system of international relations in general and the Security Council in particular. I close quotations. 30 years later, we African leaders are still making the same simple request for a permanent seat on the Security Council with the power of a veto. So today, Madam President, I stand here in this exact spot and ask the world, if not now, then when? We demand not only a reform of the Security Council, but also a reset of the global financial architecture, which is currently rigged against Africa. Africa must have a greater say in the world's multilateral financial institutions. And while I'm making requests, I'd like to call for the removal of the blockade on Cuba. As Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, our nation's founder, famously said, we seek to be friends with all and enemies to none. The Cuban people shed their blood on African soil in the fight against apartheid. And indeed, Cuba has been and continues to be a faithful friend of Africa. You see, the very fact that I can stand here and ask these things and say these things, and the fact that all nations can ostensibly gather here to address critical global issues, air our grievances, and express our concerns, that is what makes the survival of this organization so important. In every old city or village, you will find a town square, or a courtyard, or a plaza that once served as a gathering space for the citizens of the community and their leaders. Meetings and celebrations were held there, as were trials and elections. And these were spaces that brought people together and held them together as a community. Sadly, time and technology have eroded these spaces. Madam President, in many ways, the United Nations is the proverbial town square of our modern global village. And it has never been more critical for us to protect this one space that brings and holds the world nations together as a community. The internet, social media platforms, and artificial intelligence offer us the illusion of connectivity, when in fact what they do is reinforce isolation by using algorithms that ensure that we do not receive new ideas and perspectives, but rather more of the same content. We are served alternative facts and manipulated images, making it easy to disseminate disinformation and sow seeds of division amongst communities. Madam President, these are dangerous times. Our world is currently experiencing a rise in nationalism and economic instability. There's a general breakdown of multilateralism. Various acts of aggression have been committed against the sovereignty of others, and nations are attempting to circumvent the very safeguards that were put in place to prevent large-scale global conflict. These conditions are all too similar to the ones that led to the League of Nations' failure in fulfilling its mandate. The denial of visas to President Abbas and the Palestinian delegation sets a bad precedent and should be deeply worrying to all member nations of the United Nations. Ghana recognized the state of Palestine in 1988 and supported a two-state solution to the conflict since then. And I say, contrary to the claims of some, a two-state solution would not be a reward for Hamas. It would rather be a reprieve for the hundreds of thousands of innocent women and children and people who are facing collective punishment and forced starvation for no reason other than the fact that they are Palestinian. For nearly 2 years and for the fear of reprisals, we here in this General Assembly have been playing hide and seek with language to find the right words to help us avoid or excuse what we all know is taking place in Gaza. But here's the thing, it doesn't matter what you call it. If it looks like a duck, it swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck, well, then it must be a duck. The crimes in Gaza must stop. The crimes in Gaza must stop. Madam President, I also want to draw particular attention to the conflict in Sudan, which this body has described as the world's largest humanitarian crisis. 12 million people have had to flee their homes. And when we speak of migration, we refer to the 12 million new Sudanese refugees, whom we as a global community should be willing to assist in much the same way that many member nations readily assisted new refugees coming out of Ukraine. Let's dispense with the euphemisms and dog whistles and speak frankly. It is not a mystery that when leaders of Western nations complain of their migration problems, they are often referring to immigrants from the global south. But many of those immigrants are climate refugees. And interestingly, the global north emits 75% more greenhouse gases than the global south. However, the effects of climate change are more severe in the global south because we lack the resources to address them effectively. And so when the desert encroaches on our villages and towns and they become unlivable, we are forced to flee. Warsan Shire, a Somali-born prophet, a Somali-British poet born in Kenya to Somalian refugee parents, was London's first youth poet laureate. She writes in her poem titled Home. And it says, you have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. No one bends their palms under trains beneath carriages. No one spends days and nights in the stomach of a truck feeding on newspaper unless the miles traveled mean something more than just a journey. Madam President, we cannot normalize cruelty. We cannot normalize hatred. We cannot normalize xenophobia and racism. If we're going to tell a story, let's not tell its slant. Let's tell all the truth. When we speak of migrants, we speak of Mami Ewusi Mensah Frimpong, a judge on the U.S. District Court for the Central District of California. She's the first black female judge on any of California's 4 federal district courts. She was born here in America to immigrant parents from Ghana. We speak of Peter Bosman, a medical doctor in Ghana who moved to the town of Piran in Slovenia in the 1980s and later became the first black mayor of Piran, the first black mayor in Slovenia and in the whole of Eastern Europe. We speak of T. Michael, the iconic Ghanaian Norwegian artist and designer. And of course, we speak of the late Kofi Annan, former United Nations Secretary General. Former United Nations Secretary General and Nobel Peace Prize recipient, who was born in Ghana but spent his adulthood in various places in America and Europe. These are people who have brought great distinction to the countries that they decided to call home. Just as the migrants and the children of migrants before them did, I dare say these are not invaders. These are not criminals. Madam President, the slave trade must be recognized as the greatest crime against humanity. As the African champion on reparations, Ghana intends to introduce a motion in this August body to that effect. More than 12.5 million Africans were forcibly taken against their will and transported to create wealth for the powerful Western nations. We must demand reparations for the enslavement of our people and the colonization of our land that resulted in the theft of our natural resources, as well as the looting of artifacts and other items of cultural heritage that have yet to be returned in total. We recognize the value of our land and the value of our lives, as did our colonizers, as well as the governments that happily paid reparations to former slave owners as compensation for the loss of their property in quotes. And that property for which they received compensation was paid referred to enslaved people who had been freed. Madam President, an increasingly insecure world is witnessing upward spending on defense budgets of bilateral partners and steep cuts in official development assistance. Since July 2024, it is estimated that there's been a 40% drop in humanitarian aid globally. In this era of global uncertainty, Africa must exercise sovereignty over its natural resources to raise the necessary funds to ensure the well-being of its citizens. The days of parceling out vast concession areas to foreign interests for exploitation must come to an end. We'll continue to welcome foreign investment, but we must negotiate better for a bigger share of the natural resources that belong to us. And we must insist on value addition to these resources. We're tired of the continued image of poverty-stricken, disease-ridden rural communities living at the periphery of huge foreign-controlled natural resource concession areas. We're tired of having people extract the most they can from us and in return offer us the very least by way of respect, consideration, and dignity. We're tired of not being represented in ways that reveal the richness and complexity of our history or acknowledge all that we have overcome to arrive here in this liminal space of untold possibilities. Allow me to echo the Indian-American writer Arundhati Roy, who wrote, "Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing." I want to add that for the sake of Africa, and quite selfishly for the sake of my 18-year-old daughter, I hope that this new world that is arriving is a place of safety and equality for women and girls. To succeed, we must empower everyone, including women and girls, to reach their full potential. In closing, Madam President, I'd like to congratulate you on your election to preside over this historic 80th General Assembly and on being the 5th woman to hold this distinction. I'd also like to congratulate Her Excellency Nana Jane Opoku-Agyeman on being the first woman Vice President of Ghana. Now every Ghanaian girl knows the heights to which she can ascend. Words matter, but issues of representation matter even more, which is why Ghana looks forward to the appointment of a woman as Secretary General of this organization in the near future. Madam President, Your Excellencies, I thank you for your kind attention.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Ghana. The Assembly.
Well, President John Dramani Mahama there before the UN General Assembly, just raising some key concerns. We'll be fleshing it out here on the Pulse. Joining me now is international relations expert, Dr. Nanaya Mreku. Also joining us is Nana Safweje, his deputy ranking member on Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee and Regional Integration Committee. And then we'll also be joined by Dr. Ishmael Hobo later, another international relations expert, as we explore this further. I'm just looking at some key things which I've noted that the president just raised concerns about. And I'd like us to take it one after the other, really. The president said today that if it looks like a duck, it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, definitely it is a duck. And he was referring to the crime in Gaza. In fact, he quantified it as a crime. We're now hearing our president openly condemn the situation in Gaza, pushing for a two-state system. Does that compromise Ghana's non-alliance stance? I'll start with you, Doc.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for having me on your show. I for one, this is my thought. This is what I think. I do not think that Ghana's position now, as regards recognizing the two-state solution, is a deviation from Ghana's non-aligned, foreign policy. I think the president clearly echoed the fact that the two-state solution is something that was recognized by Ghana way back in 1998. And I think that whatever decision we take as Ghanaians and as the leader of the country, it nears to the national interest of the country. For a very long time, we've tried to play that, neutral position, between the Israel-Palestinian case. But I think that the evidence is very glaring, and sometimes you ought to speak truth to power. You don't have to compromise your moral grounds just because you want to play safe in international politics, because you've seen the overwhelming votes in support of what is happening in Gaza. And so I think that representing Ghana and knowing the fact as it is, there is no other way but to tell what is happening. And I like how, he started by arguing the fact that if it moves like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it does everything like a duck. Obviously, it is what it is, happening in Gaza. So I don't think it's a deviation from Ghana's, non-aligned, foreign policy.
But then really,
we've had those politics.
Wouldn't it fracture Ghana's existing diplomatic relationship with Israel, for example?
No, I do not think so. I mean, like I'm saying, we don't have to compromise morality on grounds that we want to save face with a certain, state. We do what is in our national interest. And I think at this moment, it is the truth out there. I do not think that doing this is going to rupture the relationship with Israel. I don't think that is going to happen. I believe that Israelis know that as an independent, sovereign people, we have our foreign policy, our national interest that we want to chart. And so if this is the position of the first gentleman of the land, what it means is that, this is the path that we are going. I don't think that it has anything to rupture relationship, with Israel. In fact, Israel, the first time that Ghana abstained on the resolution that was passed against that country, we saw how Israel ambassador to Ghana was in the country and not very happy with it. But we stood our grounds and let him know what our national interest is in this case.
Yeah, stay with me. Let me just bring in Felix Kwachiofosu, government spokesperson, just to get his brief reaction here on the pulse. We appreciate your time. We've been hearing from the president openly condemn what is happening in Gaza, calling it a crime scene, really. Doesn't that fracture Ghana's relationship with Israel?
Well, Ghana's relationship with the international community cannot be premised on deliberate efforts to close our eyes to clear wrongdoing. And I do not see how stating the fact, which the United Nations itself has recognized, can result in any fractured relationship. The fact of the matter is that what is happening in Gaza is extremely troubling, and we all see it on a daily basis. And while the government of Ghana and the people of Ghana do not countenance acts of terrorism, we simply are not going to close to glaring violations of the rights of the people of Gaza. And it is that the president, in stating what the situation actually is on the ground.
And then another key concern that the president raised today before the UN General Assembly is that push once again for Africa to get a permanent seat on the Security Council. This is not the first time that call has been made. How realistic do you think that push is at this point in time?
Well, they say persistence, peace. Whilst it is true that it is not the first time this matter has come, there is a need to continue the advocacy at the highest level. So it was opportune for President Mahama to use the occasion of his address to the United Nations General Assembly to reiterate that demand, which all Africans believe in. And we are hopeful that in due course, in very short order, these demands will be acceded to, and Africa will find its right place among the community of nations where it matters most.
And he's also pushing for the removal of the blockade on Cuba. How does it benefit us really as a country to openly, in that global stage, side with Cuba?
Well, again, we do not need to have benefited directly, or we do not need to benefit directly from the removal of the Cuban blockade to demand that what is right must be done. Indeed, this is a decade-old case that Ghana has this matter, and we've made up at almost every Nations Assembly. So it is between our faith and our policy, and we believe that it is something that is necessary so that Cuba can live within the freedoms that they are entitled as a people.
And then another concern being raised, really, just hearing the president push for the removal of the embargo that has been placed on the visa grants to the president of Palestine. Just openly doing that, really, it means Ghana has taken a stance. Would there be implications for us moving forward?
I've already told you that as a nation, we have to state what is the fact. And when there are developments that are not in tandem with the principles underpinning international diplomacy and international relations, we should be able to indicate this. So, whereas we remain non-aligned, we are not in any way, shape, or form going to stay aloof when we see that things are being done that can fracture the relationship that should exist within the international political order. And it's for that reason that the president has made this call. I think that it is fair, it is just. The United Nations was set up as an institution where through dialogue, trusty relations amongst nations could be addressed. The UN was set up in the aftermath of the World War II to ensure that the violent confrontations that occurred during the war do not recur. So at every point in time, opportunity must be created for all sides, all shades of opinion within the international world order to be heard so that common ground can be achieved on the matters that are important. And that is the reason why President Mahama has made the call that he has made.
But can we truly say now, at this point in time, that we are non-aligned?
Again, you must understand non-alignment. Non-alignment means we do not subscribe to the ideology of the West or the East. That is what it means. It does not mean that if wrongdoing is happening, we cannot say it, or that we should be duplicitous or hypocritical in our stance regarding developments within the international arena. So it's very, very important that you understand what non-alignment means. Do not be misled by claims by the opposition, who in the past have been on the side of wrong and have supported nations that were oppressing others. Staying non-aligned does not mean that if there is genocide in one country, it should not be spoken to. It simply means that we don't subscribe to the ideology of Western nations or Eastern nations. We subscribe to ideology that we believe will further our interests as a country. But within that particular context, it is imperative that if events occur that are globally recognized to constitute wrongdoing, we say it as it is. That is all that has happened.
Thank you so much, Felix Kwachiofosu. He is government spokesperson. Well, I still will have with me Nanaya Miracle. Let me just come to you to just speak your thoughts on this. We've just been hearing from the president make that push once more for equal representation on the Security Council. He's pushing for a seat for Africa. This is not the first time that call has been made. How realistic is it really?
Let me just say something about the previous discussion before I go on to answer your question. You know, when Nkrumah, this whole idea of non-alignment came up, right? Nkrumah conceptualized it in a phrase, and he said that we look neither to the east or to the west, but we look forward. So, speaking the truth and speaking to fact or data does not necessarily compromise the fact that we are aligned or that we belong to a certain group of states in the International Committee of States. What it means is that we are taking a position that inures to the national interest of Ghana, and that could mean going forward and neither looking to the east or to the west. So I just want us to dissociate from this whole idea that because Ghana has a long-standing foreign policy of non-alignment, it means that we cannot take certain positions in international politics if it inures to our national interest. That said, I think that there is the need to keep certain, certain subjects in conversation, to keep the wheels running, to drive a certain cause concerning Africa's representation, and the need to restructure the United Nations systems. Otherwise, it becomes a tyranny of the minority, and it doesn't really augur well for democratic ethos. You understand? And so this drive, it looks as if it's an overbeaten drum. It looks as if nothing is done for all the number of years we held UN hunger sessions, and yet all that countries from the global south keep getting is non-permanent membership of the Security Council. It does not also mean that we need to stop talking about this. I think that we need to keep the conversation going, and I am hoping that in the quest, now that the idea of restructuring the UN is becoming stronger by the day, at some point, realistically, we should begin to have countries from Africa, considering the magnitude, the gravitas that the continent holds. We should begin to have some representation, in the Security Council. It looks like it's a far-fetched idea. In fact, realists will tell you this is it's like an utopian thought. You are romanticizing this idea, but I think that we need to keep this particular conversation, ongoing. This idea of restructuring the United Nations, I think it's a very important thought that we need to keep going.
Indeed. And now to my question, really. We're pushing for equal representation on the Security Council. It's not the first time Ghana has made that call. we appear not to be getting the results despite that push. Why do you think it will make a difference this time?
No. And once again, there couldn't have been a better time, right, to keep this conversation going. And it's also because if you look at what is going on in international politics, there is what you call a reversal in the international, rule-based order or the liberal international, system. There seems to be some retrogression, right? And you are having, the politics of nationalism, the politics of populism taking the center stage. And it looks as if that states that are unable to demonstrate some military might or some economic might, are relegated to the background. But in the spirit and interest of the United Nations, and as the president rightly quoted the UN articles, right, in the UN Charter, there is supposed to be a certain level of representation, equal sovereignty, right, amongst all member states of the United Nations. And so when you have what you call the end of history, as Fukuyama suggested, but we are seeing the blowback in what he said is the end of history. And then you have, small states taking center stage in international politics. It behoves member states of the United Nations to carry this message, to continue drumming home the idea that indeed, not only African states, but states from the global south, we need some representation because most of the things and most of the decisions that are taken by the UN General Assemblies, they have global implications. And some of these affect member states, on the continent. So which better way to try to inform policy, to try to change the way things are done, than having, representation in the Security Council. We need some global restructuring. And I think that we need to have that conversation going. And it's important that it's coming from no mean state than Ghana. I've always said that Ghana has diplomatic presence. As small as it is, Ghana always has that diplomatic presence. We try to point above our weight, and we have a record, to show that. And I think that this is, one of the ways that, we are demonstrating our diplomatic presence in the international scene. So I think we need to, the most important thing is that conversation needs to be had. We need to keep that, going.
Thank you so much, Nanaya Miracle, for your time here on The Pulse. You're still